The sound of rapid footsteps echoed on the polished floor. Ethan stopped. His heart nearly stopped as he heard a loud shout from behind. "Hey! Stop right there!" The cold, sharp voice of the airport security officer cut through the stillness. Ethan turned around, his eyes meeting the piercing gaze of the man in the blue uniform. The air suddenly felt thick, suffocating. "Random check," the officer sneered, a contemptuous grin briefly flashing across his face. But his eyes made it clear, this wasn't random. Ethan swallowed the rising tide of indignation. All he wanted was to get home, to reunite with his family. But the judging gaze reminded him that there were battles he could not walk away from, even after returning from the front lines. This wasn't just the story of a soldier. This was the story of millions who had been treated unjustly simply because of the color of their skin. Let's spread this message. Hit subscribe to follow more inspiring stories about justice and human rights. The story begins here, but the road to justice is still long. Will you stand with us? It was an ordinary Tuesday morning when Sergeant Ethan Taylor, a black soldier just returning after 6 months of deployment overseas, walked into the airport. After months of hard work, facing the dangers of war and harsh conditions, all he wanted was to go home, relax, and reunite with his family. This was supposed to be a peaceful return. He stood in line at the security checkpoint, doing the usual routine of removing his shoes and emptying his pockets. Everything was normal, at least that's what he thought. As Ethan walked through the metal detector and began collecting his things from the conveyor belt, a voice cut through the stillness of the air. "Hey you! Step over here." The sharp, cold voice came from a security officer. His gaze locked onto Ethan. He turned around, trying to stay calm. He hadn't done anything wrong, so why was he being singled out? The officer, dressed in simple blue uniform, pointed at him and gestured for him to move aside. Despite his confusion, Ethan maintained a polite demeanor as he walked over. "Is there a problem?" he asked, hoping for a simple explanation. The security officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at him with a cold, almost contemptuous stare, as if sizing him up. Then, suddenly, he barked, "Random check. Step over here." Ethan, already exhausted from the long flight, didn't think much of it. He'd been through security checks many times before, and a random one wasn't unusual. He just wanted to get to his gate. He quietly complied, but as he passed by, the officer's gaze made him uneasy. This wasn't the usual indifferent look of airport staff doing their job. No, this was different. It was almost hostile, as if he was being judged just for being there. Ethan tried to brush off the feeling, but the officer wouldn't relent. "What are you doing here?" he snapped. Ethan, still trying to stay composed, replied, "I just got back home from a deployment." The officer narrowed his eyes. "A soldier, huh? Funny. I didn't expect to see you here," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. It wasn't a question, but a statement. A statement that felt like an accusation. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his shoulders tense, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm just trying to get home, that's all." But the officer didn't stop. "Really? Where are you from?" His voice was a little louder now, no longer just a random check. The way he spoke, the way his eyes scanned Ethan made his skin crawl. Then he went further. "People like you are always trying to sneak into places like this. Why should I trust you?" The words hit Ethan like a punch. It wasn't just an interrogation, it was a direct attack on his very identity. His jaw tightened, and his fingers curled into fists. The patience he had maintained throughout his deployment was starting to wear thin. But he stayed silent. What could he say? Every instinct told him to stay calm, to get through this. There was nothing he could do to change the officer's mind. But just as the tension reached its breaking point, the officer made his move. He stepped forward, getting uncomfortably close, and suddenly shoved Ethan into the wall. The impact made Ethan's back snap back. He staggered slightly but quickly regained his balance. His heart pounded and his head spun. What the hell just happened? This was no longer a security check. It had become a personal assault. Something darker. The officer stood there, his eyes seething, as if daring Ethan to speak up, daring him to resist. Ethan's mind raced. What should he do? Resist? Call for help? But as he looked around, reality hit him like a ton of bricks, pressing down on his chest. No one was coming to help him. The other security officers, who had witnessed everything from start to finish, stood still. No one stepped forward, no one intervened. It was just him and this officer, caught in a moment of suffocating tension. Move! The officer barked, his grip tightening. Ethan stood frozen, his breath coming in short gasps as he tried to process everything. He was a soldier. He had been trained to fight, to handle dangerous situations. But this was something else entirely. He never imagined he would have to face this, right here in an airport, right after returning from a mission for his country. And then, just when Ethan thought things couldn't get any worse, the officer stepped back and signaled to a colleague standing nearby. "Take him away," he ordered. Ethan was stunned. Where to? Arrested? Fired? He hadn't done anything wrong. A flood of questions filled his mind, but before he could say anything, another voice rang out, cutting through the thick tension. "Sergeant Ethan." The voice was calm, steady, but filled with authority. Ethan turned around. A senior officer, Sarah Rivera, was walking toward him. Her face gave nothing away. She looked at Ethan, then turned to the officer who had instigated it all, Officer Larson. But instead of stopping the situation, she simply nodded. Ethan was overwhelmed with confusion. Was this really happening? Was this how things worked? And what happened next would completely alter his understanding of justice. Ethan never expected this. Instead of resolving the situation, Officer Rivera only glanced at him with a cold, appraising stare, as if he were just another suspect. She didn't speak directly to him. Instead, she turned to Officer Larson, the one who had started all of this. "What's going on here?" Officer Rivera asked, but her tone was flat, as if she had already made up her mind about what had happened. Larson quickly shot a look at Ethan, his face smug, then responded. "This guy is trouble. He doesn't respect me, doesn't follow my orders. I don't trust him. He needs to be removed from here." Ethan's jaw tightened. He couldn't believe his ears. Trouble? He was the one who had been slammed into a wall, and now he was being accused of disrespecting someone? His frustration boiled up, but he kept silent. Training had taught him to stay calm and control his emotions. After all, he was facing people in power, and one wrong move could make everything worse. Officer Rivera didn't even look at Ethan. She was focused entirely on Larson, trying to make sense of the situation. But then she just nodded and walked past, as though the matter was settled. "All right," she said coldly, and just like that, it seemed like everything had ended. Ethan was stunned. He felt completely ignored. His presence was dismissed by the very people who were supposed to uphold justice. Was this really happening? Had things gotten this far? He wanted to scream, demand an explanation. But before he could say anything, Larson turned to him with a cold look that could freeze anyone. "You're not going anywhere," Larson sneered. "We've had enough of you." Ethan's mind spun. What was happening? Why was no one helping him? He tried to ask again. "Is there a problem? I just want to go home. I haven't done anything wrong." But his words fell on deaf ears. Larson had given orders, demanding that Ethan follow him to a different part of the airport. Ethan didn't move. He stood there, staring at Larson, trying to process the truth of what was happening. But instead of calmly resolving the situation, Larson became more hostile. "Don't make this worse for yourself," he warned, stepping closer to Ethan again. His voice now had a threatening edge, and Ethan could feel his heartbeat quicken. He knew that any misstep could have serious consequences. He didn't want to escalate things further, but he couldn't understand what was happening. "All right," Ethan muttered, swallowing his anger. He could feel the tension in the air, but had no idea what was coming next. Was he being arrested? Was he being taken for interrogation? The uncertainty weighed on him like a heavy, suffocating cloud. As Ethan reluctantly followed Larson to a quieter area of the airport, the full weight of the situation finally hit him. The officer was treating him like a criminal, not a soldier returning home. He hadn't done anything to deserve this treatment. He was being punished for something he couldn't comprehend, and the silence from Officer Rivera, the one who should have helped, only made the situation worse. In that moment, everything came crashing down on him. He had never felt so alone and powerless. He wished he could find someone, anyone, to turn to for help, but all he had was the bitter realization that, in this moment, he wasn't being seen as a soldier. He was just a black man treated like a threat. As Ethan followed Officer Larson down the hallway, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was happening too fast, too unexpectedly. He tried to stay calm, but inside, everything was spinning. Why was this happening? He hadn't done anything to anger this officer. His only crime was being a black soldier, inadvertently crossing paths with a man clearly looking for trouble. The silence of Officer Rivera still echoed in his mind. Why hadn't she intervened? Why had she let Larson continue without saying a word? They arrived at a small security room tucked away in a corner of the airport. Ethan hesitated for a moment, but Larson motioned for him to go in. "Sit down," Larson ordered, pointing to the worn chair by the desk. Ethan, not knowing what else to do, complied. But his mind couldn't stop racing. The walls seemed to close in on him, and the suffocating silence only made everything worse. Larson sat behind the desk, eyeing Ethan as though he were just a nuisance. "You got a reason for explaining yourself?" he asked, tapping his fingers on the desk. The officer's face was cold, emotionless, and Ethan couldn't tell whether this was his usual demeanor or something more malicious, something deeper. He still couldn't process the fact that this officer had actually pushed him, an act that should never happen in a situation like this. Yet that feeling seemed to be pushed aside, as if it didn't matter. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to regain his composure. "I don't understand. I haven't done anything wrong. Why am I being treated like this?" His voice was firm, but it was hard to hide the frustration. He had tried to remain polite from the beginning, trying to show respect. But now standing here in this small room, he realized that none of that mattered. His presence, his uniform, his skin color, none of it mattered to Larson. Larson didn't respond right away. He just stared at Ethan, his gaze cold and intense, as if he were waiting for something, waiting for Ethan to make a mistake or show weakness. Finally, he spoke, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think you can just walk in here in that uniform and act like you're above everyone else? Like we should roll out the red carpet for you? This isn't how things work here." The words cut into Ethan like a knife. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Is this really happening?" he thought. "Is this really how he sees me?" But he stayed silent, not wanting to make the situation worse. Larson was deliberately escalating things, and Ethan knew he shouldn't add to it. But the officer's words continued to echo in his mind. "You think you're above everyone else?" Ethan had spent years serving his country, working alongside people from all walks of life. He had earned every bit of respect his uniform brought, but to Larson, none of that mattered. In Larson's eyes, Ethan wasn't a soldier. He was just a black man who needed to be pushed aside, controlled, humiliated. Larson stepped closer, his gaze even colder. "You don't belong here," he muttered, almost to himself. "I've met people like you before. You think the world owes you something just because you wear that uniform, but you don't get to walk around acting like you're better than everyone else. Not here, not today." Ethan's anger flared like fire. It was hard to believe that someone wearing the same badge, the same uniform as him, could think like this, could treat another human being this way. He wanted to shout, to tell Larson he was wrong, that what he was doing wasn't just unjust, it was disgusting. But Ethan bit his lip, knowing that any outburst would only make things worse. Instead, he sat still, silently absorbing the harsh reality that this officer was deliberately treating him like trash just because of his skin color. That weight pressed down on him like a stone in his stomach. This wasn't just a botched random check. This was something deeper, something far more troubling. The silence in the room stretched on, and Ethan could feel his chest tighten. Larson remained silent, his eyes never leaving Ethan's, as though he was waiting for a reaction. But Ethan didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing him break. He simply sat there, silently challenging Larson, holding on to the last bit of control he had in the situation. After what felt like an eternity, Larson suddenly stood up, the chair scraping loudly across the floor. "I don't know what your problem is," he said, shaking his head, "but I'm done. We don't need people like you here. You're just a troublemaker." Ethan's heart tightened and sank. "Done? What does that mean?" Larson walked toward the door, but before stepping out, he turned back, his gaze cold and menacing. "Get out of here, soldier. You're not welcome." With that, he left, leaving Ethan alone in the small, cold room, feeling utterly powerless. Ethan sat still for a moment, his mind spinning. What just happened? How did everything go wrong so quickly? He had expected an explanation, or at least an apology, but instead he was dismissed, cast aside as though his presence was a problem. None of it made sense. None of it was right. But the worst part was yet to come, and Ethan didn't know how much worse it would get. Ethan sat there in that small room with time stretching on endlessly. Larson's words echoed in his mind. "We don't need people like you here." The words felt like a slap to the face, but also strangely familiar. The weight of those words seemed to bear down on him, like a ghost haunting him. The heaviness of what had just happened pressed down harder on Ethan. He had been humiliated, treated like an outsider in the very country he had fought to protect. And for what? Just because a racist officer decided that a soldier didn't belong in this airport. The hallway outside the office had become quiet. The usual hustle and bustle of the airport had disappeared, replaced by the oppressive silence that followed the incident. Ethan walked toward the door, trying to ignore the stares of the officers standing nearby, their eyes following him as he passed. He couldn't tell if they were watching because they were complicit or if they just didn't care. Either way, it felt like the entire system had turned its back on him. He had just been kicked out of the airport, discarded like trash, and there was nothing he could do about it. But as he reached the door and stepped outside, a voice called him from behind. "Ethan!" He turned around, startled. It was Larson again, standing just outside the security office. Larson walked toward him, his face still cold, but now there was something different in his eyes, something deeper, something more threatening. "Before you go," Larson said, his voice dripping with contempt, "I want you to understand something. We don't accept people like you here. You can wear that uniform, but you don't belong in this airport. Not now, not ever." Ethan's hands clenched into fists, his body tense, but he said nothing. There was no point in saying anything anymore. Larson had made his decision, and nothing Ethan said would change that. Rather than continue arguing, he turned and walked away, leaving the airport behind. The injustice still pierced him, but Ethan knew one thing for sure. This wasn't the end. The fight to defend his dignity, his right to be treated as a human being and not a threat, was far from over. He didn't know what would come next, but one thing was certain. He wouldn't let this moment define him. As Ethan walked away from the airport, the rage inside him had not faded. Larson's cold words still echoed in his ears, each one a reminder of the deep-rooted racism he faced. He was a soldier, he had served his country, put his life on the line, and now he was being kicked out of an airport simply because of his skin color. It was absurd. Everything about it was absurd. How could someone, dressed in the same uniform, someone who was supposed to uphold justice, treat him this way? How could a simple security check turn into an act of racism, something he was all too familiar with? The parking lot was almost empty when Ethan reached his car. He opened the door with a click and sat in the driver's seat, gripping the wheel tightly. His mind was racing, unsure of what to do now. The weight of the situation still hadn't fully hit him. He wasn't just angry, he was heartbroken. He had believed that no matter what happened, the system would protect him. He had hoped for fairness, but today, that fairness had been stripped away in an instant. Ethan started the car, the engine's roar breaking the silence, and he pulled out of the parking lot. His thoughts kept spiraling. How many years had he fought for this country, and now this was how it treated him? He wondered how many others had been treated like this. As the miles passed, his anger began to transform into something else: determination. This wasn't just a one-off incident, a racist cop. This was part of something bigger. Ethan had seen it on the news, heard about the stories of injustice, of black men and women being mistreated by the very people who were supposed to protect them. He had always known about racism, but experiencing it firsthand was something else. Felt like a slap to the face. And now he couldn't just walk away, pretending it didn't happen. But what could he do? How could he make them understand the pain, the humiliation he had just endured? Ethan thought about the people in the airport, the ones who had witnessed everything. Why hadn't anyone intervened? Why hadn't anyone said anything? Was it because they didn't care, or because they were afraid? He couldn't know for sure, but it didn't matter. Ethan couldn't rely on anyone else to stand up for him. He would have to fight this battle alone. By the time he reached his apartment, his anger had shifted into a quiet resolve. He was determined to do something about what had happened. He knew that what Larson had done wasn't just a personal failure. It was a reflection of a broken system, a system that allowed racism to persist unchecked, even in places where it should have been eradicated. Ethan knew he couldn't let this go. If he let it slide, it would happen again to someone else. He walked into the apartment and dropped his bag onto the floor. The familiar surroundings didn't feel warm like they usually did. All he could feel now was the weight pressing down on him. He took out his phone, stared at the screen, his finger hovering over the keyboard. He had so much to say, but where to start? Should he file a complaint? Should he go public with the story? Ethan's fingers began to type, slowly at first, then faster as the words started to flow. This wasn't just about me, he thought as he typed. This is about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. He couldn't just let this go. He couldn't. Soon, Ethan had written a long post on social media, recounting what had happened at the airport, how Officer Larson had berated him, how he had been humiliated and kicked out just because of his skin color. He wrote about the lack of support from Officer Rivera, about the sense of helplessness and abandonment he felt in that small room. He shared the pain, the frustration, and the anger he had felt in that room, trapped between a racist cop and a system unwilling to acknowledge its own flaws. He hit post and leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the screen. Just a few seconds later, notifications started popping up. Comments, shares, likes. People were reading his story. Now, it wasn't just about him. It had become about making sure his voice was heard, about standing up for those who might be going through the same thing. The heaviness still weighed on his chest, but for the first time since the incident, Ethan felt like he was doing something. He didn't know where this would lead, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going to back down. He couldn't let this injustice slide. The fight was far from over, and now, more than ever, he was ready to face it. The hours after Ethan posted his story were filled with uncertainty. At first, it felt like nothing was happening. The silence was overwhelming, as if the world was waiting for someone to acknowledge his pain, to stand by him. But then, little by little, the comments started appearing. At first, it was just a few people sharing similar experiences, those who could understand the feeling of being wrongly targeted, sending words of encouragement. "You're not alone," one wrote. "This is happening all over this country." Then more people joined in. Ethan's phone buzzed nonstop as more people saw his post, shared it, and commented on it. His inbox was flooded with messages, some from strangers, some from old friends and colleagues. People were thanking him for speaking out, for sharing a story that so many others had buried under the weight of silence and fear. He was taken aback by the support, overwhelmed by it, yet there was an unsettling feeling creeping in, as if something wasn't quite right among the words of encouragement. Some messages were hostile, accusing him of making up stories or exaggerating the situation. "You should be grateful they let you through," one user wrote. "You're making this about race when it's not," another message read. "You're just seeking attention. Don't stir up more trouble." Ethan's heart sank as he read those messages. A part of him had known that there would be people trying to dismiss him, but seeing those words on the screen, the blatant disrespect for his pain, hurt more than he had imagined. Still, he didn't let those messages stop him. He had seen this before, the way people deny the reality of racism, the way some twist the story to defend their biases. But Ethan wouldn't back down. He wouldn't let those messages silence him or erase his truth. As the evening wore on, his story continued to spread. The media began to reach out for statements, for interviews. His post had gone viral, attracting the attention of local news stations and influencers on social media. Many, of whom were equally outraged by what had happened, felt like a dream. Ethan had never imagined his experience would become a public call to action. But now, it was spreading across the country, turning into a conversation that people could no longer ignore. No longer just an isolated airport incident. It wasn't just his issue anymore. It was about a much larger, deeper problem within American society, an issue that affected people of color every day. That night, as Ethan scrolled through an ever-growing sea of responses, a sudden realization hit him. The wave of responses wasn't just because people agreed with him, but because those who had witnessed what happened recognized that they had to do something. It was a collective outrage that had been simmering for a long time, waiting for a moment like this to explode. Ethan realized that he had sparked something much bigger than himself. The calls began pouring in. There were calls from organizations dedicated to racial justice, offering support, asking him to share his story with a wider public. There were also calls from legal groups advising him to file a formal complaint, to take the matter to court. But Ethan wasn't sure about that. The legal system had never been fair to people like him. What good would it do? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just his fight. It was a systemic issue, a bigger problem. But he knew he had to keep speaking out because his voice now mattered. Just as everything seemed to be unfolding at a dizzying pace, Ethan's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from his commanding officer, Coral. "Ethan?" came the stiff, formal voice on the other end. "This is Lieutenant Matthew from your unit. I've seen what's going on, and I just wanted to call to check if you're okay." Ethan was surprised. "Thank you, Lieutenant," he said, his voice softer, the fatigue of the day beginning to settle in his muscles. "I'm okay, but there's a lot to think about. I didn't expect this to blow up like it has." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Then Lieutenant Matthew spoke again, his tone a little gentler. "Look, I can't speak for the airport, but I want you to know that I support you. If you need anything, don't hesitate to reach out. We're a team, and as far as I'm concerned, you did nothing wrong." Ethan nodded, though Lieutenant Matthew couldn't see him. Hearing those words, "You did nothing wrong," felt like a small weight lifting off his shoulders. It was a reminder that not everyone in power thought like Larson, that not everyone was willing to turn a blind eye to injustice. It made him feel a little better, though the situation was far from over. After hanging up, Ethan stared at his phone. He had spoken with a few supporters, but this was different. These were people from his unit, people he had served alongside, people who had fought beside him. The reality began to sink in. This was his chance to create real change. Not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever endured such treatment. This wasn't about personal revenge or settling a score. This was about exposing a problem that had been ignored for far too long. He was no longer just a soldier. Ethan was becoming a symbol, a voice for those silenced by fear or the system. It was about raising awareness of systemic racism in law enforcement, about giving a platform to those who had been overlooked for far too long. As the night wore on, Ethan knew the battle was far from over. The road ahead would be difficult, but he was no longer afraid. He now had a cause, the support of his community, and the courage to keep pushing forward, no matter the obstacles. The world was listening, and Ethan was ready for his voice to be heard. The following days passed in a blur of interviews, calls, and messages flooding in from every corner of the internet. Ethan barely had time to process everything. His story had sparked outrage, but it had also ignited conversations he never imagined he'd be a part of. People were talking about racism, abuse of power, and the deep-rooted systemic racism embedded in institutions across the country. It was no longer just an isolated airport incident. It was a symptom of a much larger issue. Despite the overwhelming support, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of exhaustion. Every interview, every message felt like another reminder of the humiliation he had endured, another blow to his sense of security. He had spent years in the military, fighting for the country, believing it would protect him. But in that airport, in that small room with Officer Larson, he had come to a painful truth. The country he had sworn to serve didn't always see him as an equal. Still, he knew this issue was bigger than him. He had opened a door, and now people were starting to listen. But with that attention came pressure. The more people knew about his story, the more they expected him to do something with it, to act in a way that would create change. Ethan felt the weight of that responsibility, but what could he do? What was the right thing to do in this situation? Could he change anything, or was he just one of many voices on a long list of people who had tried and failed? One afternoon, a call came from a prominent civil rights organization. Ethan had heard of them before, the Alliance for Justice and Equality. They had worked on cases like his for years, fighting for victims of racism and police violence. When the voice on the other end of the phone introduced themselves as one of their senior attorneys, Ethan's heart raced. "Lieutenant Ethan, we've been following your story closely. What happened to you at the airport is unacceptable, and we want to help you. You don't have to face this alone." The relief he felt in that moment was overwhelming. He had been struggling with the decision of whether to take legal action, unsure if anyone would listen, but now, with the backing of a major organization, everything felt different. It was no longer just his word against that of a police officer. Now, there was a team of experienced people who believed in his cause, who would fight with him. "We're ready to support you in any way we can. We can help you file an official complaint, bring this into the public eye, or even take it to court if that's the route you want to take." The attorney's voice continued. "You've started something big, and we want to help you see it through." Ethan sat in silence for a moment, unsure how to process everything he had just heard. The thought of fighting a legal battle was daunting. He had never been in a courtroom, and just the idea of facing the very system that had betrayed him terrified him. But as he thought more about it, the fear began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of determination. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all those who had been treated like he was, all those who had suffered from racism and abuse of power with no one to turn to. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but full of resolve. "I'm ready. Let's get started." The lawyer's voice grew lighter. "Good. We'll begin immediately. We'll make sure your story is heard, and you will receive the justice you deserve." In the following weeks, everything moved quickly. Ethan's case garnered widespread media attention, and public opinion began to shift. Images of the incident at the airport, the way the police shoved him, how he was treated, were shared across social media and news outlets, amplifying the conversation. People were furious, but they were also motivated. Protests began to break out in cities across the country, with people demanding justice not only for Ethan but for all victims of racial discrimination in public spaces. At first, Ethan didn't know what to think. The support was overwhelming, but so was the attention. Every time he turned on the TV or checked his phone, there were more headlines about the incident, more interviews asking how he felt. Some days, he felt like he was losing himself in all of this, as if his identity was being shaped by something bigger than him. But on the other hand, a sense of purpose was slowly emerging. People were finally starting to talk about the issues he'd been fighting for all along. The fact that his story had generated such awareness meant the message was reaching people, and they were beginning to understand what so many others had endured. Then one morning, he received a call that changed everything. It was from the airport. The voice on the other end was polite but serious. "Lieutenant Ethan, the representative is speaking. We want to formally apologize for the incident that occurred that day. We have conducted an internal review and have taken disciplinary action against Officer Larson. We understand this situation has caused deep harm and want to assure you that we are committed to preventing this from happening again." Ethan's mind spun. An apology, disciplinary action. It seemed like a small victory, but something didn't sit right. Larson had been allowed to act like that without fear of punishment for so long. Was this apology genuine, or was it just an attempt to quell the growing outrage? He pressed the representative. What exactly is the disciplinary action? And how do I know this won't happen to someone else? The representative quickly responded, "We are implementing additional sensitivity training for all security personnel, and Officer Larson has been suspended while further investigation takes place. We are also reviewing our policies to ensure this does not happen again." Ethan didn't feel relief, even though it was a small concession. The suspension of Officer Larson didn't change anything. What about the culture that had allowed him to act this way in the first place? What about the other officers who stood by and did nothing? What about the system that protected people like Larson, allowing them to use power to humiliate and control others? Ethan knew the apology was just the beginning. The road ahead was still long, but at least it was a step in the right direction. And now, with the support of his legal team, the public's attention, and the voices of thousands of people behind him, Ethan was ready to see it through to the end. The fight for justice had only just begun. The weeks that followed passed quickly. Ethan, along with his legal team, began preparing for the next phase of the battle. The airport's apology no longer held any value for him. It was just a small concession to calm the storm, not a real confrontation with the deeper issues of racial discrimination within law enforcement. But Ethan wasn't in this fight just to receive a simple apology. He was fighting for something much bigger. He wouldn't stop until the entire system that allowed officers like Larson to act without accountability was held responsible. Civil rights organizations worked closely with Ethan, playing a vital role in advancing the cause. They helped draft press releases, coordinated protests, and ensured his story stayed at the forefront of public consciousness. This wasn't just about an airport incident anymore. It was about systemic change. Ethan began receiving calls from others who had experienced similar incidents. Black soldiers, workers, parents, and students, each sharing their story of racial discrimination and police abuse of power. The more he heard, the more determined he became. This was no longer just his fight. It was the fight of thousands, even millions, who had suffered in silence for far too long. But there was another side to this. Ethan was now facing constant public scrutiny. His social media became a battleground, where people praised his courage, but also condemned him for stirring up trouble. His phone rang incessantly, sometimes with offers of support, other times with threats and hateful messages. The pressure from all of this was overwhelming, at times making him feel like he couldn't breathe, as if every word, every message was another weight pressing down on him. Every action he took was scrutinized, criticized, and dissected. Despite the immense pressure, he knew he had to keep moving forward. He had started this fight, and he couldn't turn back now. He couldn't let the noise around him derail him. There were people who needed him to stand firm, to continue speaking out no matter how hard it got. One evening, as Ethan sat in his apartment, eyes fixed on his phone, he saw the situation escalate. The airport had released a statement declaring that Officer Larson had been temporarily suspended during the investigation and that the incident was regrettable but an isolated case. The airport had promised continued training for its staff and maintained its commitment to diversity and inclusion. Everything sounded rehearsed, like the words of a corporation trying to placate public opinion without addressing the real issue. Public response to the airport statement was swift. People were dissatisfied with that answer. The statement felt like a band-aid over a wound that needed surgery. Larson wasn't the only problem. He was just a symptom. The whole system needed to change. Ethan knew what he had to do next. The day after the airport's announcement, Ethan stood in front of the camera once again. This time, it wasn't a brief interview. It was a major news broadcast that would air nationwide. His legal team had arranged this interview to keep the pressure on, to make sure the airport couldn't dismiss the issue. Ethan felt nervous, but there was also a quiet determination within him. This was his opportunity to speak directly to the public, to tell the truth about what had happened and demand real action, not empty promises. As the crew set up, Ethan's mind drifted back to his early days in the military, when he first put on his uniform and swore to serve his country. He had been so proud at the time, proud to defend the ideals that America claimed to uphold. But after everything that had happened, after everything he had endured, he wasn't so sure anymore. How could he have spent months serving a country that didn't always treat him fairly? The interview began and Ethan took a deep breath. The host asked him about the incident, how he felt when Larson criticized and shoved him. Anger began to rise within Ethan again, but he kept his voice steady. My feeling was one of humiliation. I felt degraded. It wasn't just the shove or the way he spoke to me. It was the fact that no one stood up for me. No one said anything. Officer Rivera just stood there while Larson treated me like that, and that's what hurt the most. Knowing that the people with the power to protect us were the ones doing this. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. And it's not just me. This happens to black people every day. It happens at airports, on the streets, in schools, in stores. It happens in places where we should feel safe. And when we speak up, we're told to be quiet, not to make a scene. But this is the reality we face, and I won't be silent anymore. I won't stop until there's change. Ethan's voice was firm, each word filled with an unwavering resolve. The host nodded, clearly moved by his words. But Ethan knew this wasn't enough. The interview would air and people would watch, but the system would continue to operate unless there was real, sustained pressure to force it to change. The following days passed in a blur of interviews, protests, and ceaseless exchanges. But Ethan knew that the road ahead would not be easy. He was no longer just facing a racist cop. He was now battling a system built on injustice and inequality. The path ahead would be long and difficult, but Ethan had no intention of backing down. He had ignited a fire that could not be extinguished. This wasn't just about his case. It was about a movement that would continue to grow and demand change. Ethan would not rest until the airport and every institution like it were held accountable. This was only the beginning. As he looked into the camera and spoke the truth, he knew he was no longer a soldier. He had become the voice for those without one, a warrior in a fight larger than anything he had ever faced. The pressure didn't ease. If anything, it grew heavier as Ethan's story spread. Protests at the airport, schools, and government buildings grew larger. People marched, holding signs reading "Justice for Ethan" and "End Racism Now." His face became a symbol of resistance, of a man wronged who refused to back down. The media across the country continuously updated his story, with breaking news every day. Politicians, activists, and even celebrities began speaking out. Some expressed support while others were more cautious, but the conversation had shifted. Amid the chaos, Ethan began to feel the weight of it all. The constant phone calls, interviews, and endless messages were mentally and emotionally exhausting. There were days when he felt like he couldn't escape it, like every second of his life was consumed by the fight for justice. He was no longer just dealing with the mental scars from what had happened at the airport. Now he carried the burden of an entire movement. In the midst of this storm, Ethan found comfort in the support of family and close friends. They reminded him why he started this fight in the first place, that the injustice he faced was just a small part of a larger problem, and that it was a fight worth continuing. They reminded him that he was not alone in this battle, that millions of voices stood behind him. But even their encouragement couldn't erase the deep exhaustion he began to feel. Then a turning point came, something that gave Ethan and his supporters new hope. One morning, a message arrived. It was from Officer Rivera, the officer who had remained silent during the confrontation, who had done nothing to intervene when Larson shoved Ethan. Ethan hadn't expected anything from her, but this message was different. It was an apology, a sincere apology. I've been following the news about your case and wanted to reach out. I've thought a lot about what happened, and I realize I failed to protect you. I didn't stand up when I should have, and for that, I'm truly sorry. I can't undo the harm that was done, but I want you to know that I see you now, and I will do better moving forward. Ethan read the message over and over. At first, he didn't know how to respond, unsure whether this apology was genuine or just a reaction to public pressure. But something about it felt different. Maybe it was because Rivera had taken the time to acknowledge her role in the situation, or maybe it was because someone within the system was willing to admit their mistake. Whatever the reason, Ethan felt a shift inside himself. This was the change he had fought for, people acknowledging their wrongs, taking responsibility for their actions, and committing to do better. However, Ethan was not naive. An apology could not fix the system. A change in the mindset of one cop couldn't end racism in law enforcement. But it was a start. It was a small but meaningful step in the right direction. Ethan put the phone down, still holding it in his hand, and thought for a moment. For the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope, not just for himself but for the future. His fight was far from over, but he knew what he was doing was making an impact. The conversation had started. The walls were beginning to crack, and real change, though slow, was beginning to show. As he typed a response to Officer Rivera, thanking her for the apology but emphasizing that the work was far from done, he knew one thing for certain. This fight was worth it. Not just for himself, but for everyone who had been wronged, overlooked, or silenced. He was ready to keep fighting, no matter how long it took. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt like he wasn't walking alone. The fight for justice was far from over, but now it felt like there was a chance. As the weeks went on, the momentum behind Ethan's case grew stronger. What had started as a personal battle against a racist cop had now evolved into a powerful movement demanding accountability. Not just from law enforcement, but from all institutions. The hashtag Justice for Ethan appeared every day, with people from all walks of life speaking out in support. Not only the Black community, but anyone who believed in justice, equality, and the right to live without fear of unjust targeting stood with him. Ethan's life, once full of the silent discipline of the military, was now overflowing with the demands of the movement and public attention. He attended protests, spoke at universities, and was invited to forums where people discussed issues of racial discrimination. Ethan's words on justice and police reform were blunt, honest, and powerful, reflecting the pain and frustration many felt but had never been able to voice. Despite the growing support, Ethan still struggled with self-doubt. The pressure of representing so many made him feel weighed down. Sometimes, on late nights, he lay awake in bed, body tense, mind racing, wondering if he had done enough, if his voice was strong enough to bring about real change. The flood of opinions, both supportive and critical, made him feel exposed, vulnerable, as though he were standing naked in a crowd. But whenever he doubted himself, he thought of the people who had shared their stories with him. Stories of being targeted, silenced, and pushed aside. He was no longer fighting just for himself. He was fighting for them too. Then there were the quiet victories that fueled him. The first sign of real change came when the airport's internal investigation was completed. Officer Larson, who had been suspended during the investigation, was officially fired. The airport issued a public statement, acknowledging that Larson's actions were unacceptable and announcing new policies for racial sensitivity training. It was a step forward, but Ethan knew that wasn't enough. One cop out of thousands nationwide couldn't solve the problem. This was just a small piece of a much larger issue. But Ethan didn't stop there. He kept pushing, demanding more. He partnered with organizations and lawmakers to introduce bills calling for comprehensive police reform nationwide. The goal was not just to hold bad cops accountable, but to change the culture that allowed them to act without fear of consequences. He didn't want a few apologies or symbolic gestures. He wanted systemic change, a cultural shift that could affect every area of society, from law enforcement to corporate boardrooms. His work was not without its challenges. There were times when it seemed like public attention would gradually shift, as if the news cycle would move on to the next tragedy or scandal. But Ethan persisted, knowing that each protest, each interview, and each person who shared their story added another brick to the foundation of change. As the summer turned to fall, Ethan's fight continued, but he also began to notice the toll it was taking on him. The unrelenting media cycles, the constant interview requests, and the pressure to be the perfect spokesperson for racial justice began to take a toll on his mental health. Each day brought new challenges, new attacks, new expectations. There were days when the weight of it all made him feel like he couldn't carry it anymore. Hate mail, online racist comments, and trolls trying to smear him. It all seemed like too much to bear. He knew he couldn't let it stop him, but there were moments when he wished he could return to his peaceful life, where he didn't have to stand in the spotlight, where he didn't have to endure judgmental stares. Although he had become the face of a movement, every time he thought about quitting, Ethan remembered the people who had reached out to him, the ones who said his voice had changed their lives. They shared their pain, their stories of the injustice they had faced, and Ethan knew he couldn't turn his back on them. One of the hardest things Ethan faced was the growing division in the country. Despite receiving overwhelming support from the majority, there were still those who rejected the idea that racism was a problem in law enforcement, who saw Ethan's actions as divisive rather than unifying. Some who had once remained silent were now openly hostile. The issue was no longer just Ethan's. It was about the larger conversation on race and privilege. Everyone seemed to be picking sides. But Ethan didn't stop. He was determined not to let the negativity silence him. He kept speaking, kept raising his voice, and kept fighting for change, even though progress often seemed slow. He always reminded himself that real change couldn't happen overnight. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. In a meeting with lawmakers in Washington, Ethan was asked about his vision for the future. It was a simple question, but it made him pause. What did he really want? What was his ultimate goal in all of this? He took a deep breath before answering, "I want a world where my children don't have to fear being treated differently because of the color of their skin. I want a world where people are seen for who they are, not for the prejudices others place upon them. I want a country that lives up to the values it proclaims. Freedom, equality, justice for all, without exception." The room went silent. Ethan knew that this fight was far from over, but for the first time in many months, he felt a clarity in his mind. He knew what he was fighting for, and no matter how long it took, he couldn't stop. The change he hoped for would take years, maybe decades, perhaps even longer, but he was ready to spend his entire life fighting for it. He wasn't alone in this battle, and together, they would ensure that the world his children would inherit would be better than the one he had grown up in. The road ahead was still unclear, but Ethan now understood that true change didn't come from easy victories or quick solutions. It came from perseverance, from voices that wouldn't be silenced, and from a community willing to stand up together and demand more. With that understanding, Ethan knew he was ready for whatever came next. The battle was never over, but he was no longer just a soldier in an army. He was a soldier for justice, and he would continue to fight until the battle was won. As winter approached, the fight for justice raged on, but so did Ethan's exhaustion. His body was tired physically, mentally, and emotionally. He had been in the battle for months, constantly speaking out, fighting, and trying to balance the overwhelming expectations placed on him. Each day felt like another hard-fought battle, and the spotlight on him felt like a double-edged sword. It was a platform for change, but it was also an endless weight. Still, there were moments when Ethan felt a flicker of hope, like a reminder that this fight wasn't in vain. One of those moments came when a massive national protest was organized in Washington, D.C., and Ethan was invited to be one of the keynote speakers. Thousands of people gathered for the March for Racial Justice, and Ethan stood before them, gazing out at the sea of people united in solidarity. It was no longer just his story. It was a shared fight for equality. As he stepped up to the podium, his heart raced in his chest, each beat threatening to explode. The weight surged within him of personal pain, of the pain of everyone who had shared their stories, of the pain of a system that had long neglected people of color. It all pressed down on his shoulders, but he knew he had to speak. This was why he didn't give up, because of moments like this, when he could stand and say enough was enough. He began to speak, his voice steady but filled with passion. We're not just fighting for one person's dignity. We are fighting for all of us, for every black man, woman, and child who has ever been dehumanized, treated as less than human. We're fighting because we know this system is broken, and we won't accept it anymore. The crowd erupted in cheers, and Ethan felt a surge of strength rise within him. In that moment, it wasn't just his voice. It was the voice of thousands, maybe millions, who had been impacted by racial injustice. His words were no longer just his own. They were the words of the oppressed, of the unheard, of those cast aside by society. The power from the crowd pushed him forward, and he knew this wasn't just a protest. It was a movement, and it was growing. I will not stop fighting, he continued. And I won't let you stop fighting. This is the moment we demand real change. This is the moment we reclaim what has been stolen from us. Our dignity, our rights, our humanity. We will not rest until we see a world where justice is truly blind. The crowd roared in applause, and as Ethan stepped down from the podium, he felt a mixture of exhaustion and strength. It had been a long, difficult journey, but this was what he had been fighting for. This was the reason he had put himself into this battle, sacrificing his reputation and facing the hostility of those who didn't want to hear the truth. This fight was no longer just about his case. It was about changing a system that had been broken for far too long. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like they were on the verge of something monumental. Ethan's influence continued to grow, and with it, the pressure. As the months passed, the momentum for racial justice strengthened, but so did the opposition. The more voices called for reform, the louder the backlash grew. Some politicians and media outlets quickly dismissed the movement, labeling it a threat to the established order. Ethan's name had become a symbol, both a beacon of hope and a lightning rod for controversy. He was called everything from a hero to a troublemaker, depending on who you asked, but Ethan didn't let the criticism stop him. Each attack, each attempt to bring him down only fueled his resolve. He knew that negative reactions were inevitable. Change couldn't come without opposition. There would always be those clinging to the status quo, fighting to maintain their power at any cost. But that no longer mattered to him. What mattered were the people, the families, the students, the everyday workers who stood with him, who raised their voices, who shared their stories and said, "We can't take it anymore." He kept going, tirelessly working with lawmakers to push for meaningful reforms. He sat in meetings, drafted policy proposals, and worked with civil rights organizations to ensure that new laws would create lasting change, not just temporary fixes. Ethan's team began to build support in state capitals across the country, creating a network of activists and pushing for laws that would hold police departments accountable. His legal team filed lawsuits against institutions that had failed to act against discriminatory practices, demanding justice for the marginalized. Though the work was ongoing, there were times when Ethan felt weary. He had poured so much energy, so much pain, and so much of his heart into this fight that sometimes he wondered how much more he could give. The sleepless nights, the unrelenting pressure to perform, the endless interviews. It all felt like an enormous weight on him. There were times when it felt like the whole world was crashing down on him, when everything seemed impossible to accomplish. But then, in a quiet moment, he thought of the faces of those who had stood by him from the beginning. His family, his friends, the countless strangers who had shared their stories and supported him. They were the ones who had kept him going, the ones who reminded him that he wasn't alone in this fight. One afternoon, Ethan stood on the steps of a courthouse, preparing to speak at yet another rally. His legal team had just won a key lawsuit, one of the first real victories in the fight for police reform. This wasn't the end of the battle, but it was a significant step forward. The crowd chanted his name, and in that moment, Ethan allowed himself a breath of relief. He stepped up to the microphone, his heart steady, his voice strong. Today is not just my victory or the victory of those who have fought for justice. It's the victory of all those who have ever felt the pain of injustice. This is a reminder that when we stand together, we can make a difference. But this is just the beginning. We have a long road ahead, and I will continue to walk with you, step by step. The crowd erupted again, louder than before, and Ethan raised his fist. Clenching his hand, he felt the strength within his body, as if he were holding the entire world in his grasp. He knew this was just one battle in a much larger war, but the tide was beginning to turn. He could feel the world shifting, and with every person standing beside him, with every voice rising in protest, that change was coming faster than anyone could have imagined. And so, with the battle ahead, Ethan kept moving forward. Ethan didn't know exactly where this path would lead, but one thing was certain: he would not turn back. The road was long, the work far from finished, but the future had already begun to change, and Ethan was determined to press on, no matter the difficulties ahead. As the new year arrived, Ethan was no longer just the face of a movement. He had become a symbol of unwavering strength, a beacon for a cause that refused to be ignored. The pressure, the criticism, and the fatigue were still there, but so was the power of a nation awakening to the truth of racial injustice. Ethan was no longer just fighting for his own dignity. He was fighting for a fairer future, one where every person who had been denied equality, respect, and basic human rights would be seen, heard, and valued. It had been more than a year since the fateful day at the airport, the moment that sparked everything. The road had been long, the challenges countless. There had been legal battles, protests, media storms, and endless moments of doubt. But there had also been victories, big and small, that kept the flame of hope alive. The policy changes he had pushed for were slowly taking shape. New laws were being proposed in several states, demanding that police departments implement stricter accountability measures. Racial sensitivity training and de-escalation programs were being rolled out across the nation. Ethan knew these weren't perfect solutions, but they were the first steps toward dismantling centuries-old systems of oppression. One of the greatest victories came when a crucial federal bill was introduced, with provisions aimed at reforming the criminal justice system. This was a direct result of the grassroots efforts built around Ethan's story. People who had rallied, written letters, attended protests, and sent demands for action to lawmakers. Ethan had played a key role in pushing it forward, using his platform to lobby legislators and speak at hearings. But when the bill passed a key committee vote, the weight of it finally hit him. It wasn't a perfect bill, not by a long shot, but it was the beginning of real, measurable change. On a bitterly cold winter afternoon, Ethan stood in front of a packed room in Washington, D.C., as the President of the United States announced the passage of the bill. The room was filled with reporters, lawmakers, activists, and community leaders who had fought alongside him. Ethan was invited to speak, and as he approached the microphone, the gravity of it all, the years of hardship, the years of struggle, the long hours of relentless work weighed heavily on Ethan, but he also felt a deep sense of pride. The sweat, the sacrifices had not been in vain. "I never imagined I'd be standing here," Ethan began, his voice steady but full of emotion. "More than a year ago, I was just a soldier trying to get home, trying to get through another ordinary day. I never imagined that the events of that day would lead to this moment. But today we stand together, stronger than ever, because we refuse to accept the status quo. We refuse to let silence be the answer. We refuse to let injustice go unchecked." He paused, looking around the room, his gaze resting on the faces of those who had stood with him in this fight, those who had spoken out, protested, written letters, and believed that change was possible. "This is not just my victory. This is our victory. This is the victory of everyone who has been denied justice, of all who have felt the weight of racism and prejudice. This is a victory for our children, for the future we are building together. And though today is a huge step forward, I know the work is far from over. But if this year has taught me anything, it's that when we stand together, when we stand firm, nothing is impossible." The room erupted in applause, and in that moment, Ethan allowed himself to feel the weight of what they had achieved. This wasn't the end of the road. It was just a chapter in a much larger story. But the progress was undeniable. The nation was beginning to change, and Ethan had played a part in that change. He had become the catalyst for something bigger than any one person or goal. As he stepped off the stage, Ethan gazed out the window, looking out over the bustling city, the lights reflecting off the windows of the Capitol building. He thought about everything they had been through, the pain, the disappointment, the doubt, but also the courage, the hope, and the resilient strength of those who had fought beside him. He thought about his family, his friends, and the countless strangers who had supported him from the very beginning. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a deep, profound peace. The road ahead would still be long, and the fight was far from over. There would be more battles, more injustices to confront. But in that moment, Ethan knew they had won something great. They had started a conversation that could never be silenced. They had ignited a movement that no one could ignore. And Ethan realized this was just the beginning. This story reminds us of the power of perseverance and determination when standing up for what's right. Have you ever felt the pressure of fighting for justice, knowing the obstacles you'd face? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice could be the spark for positive change in the community. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to share it with your friends and loved ones, spreading the message of fairness and resilience. Thank you for following and supporting. Let's work together to build a fair and respectful society, one small step at a time. Wishing you strength and success. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, share, and subscribe to receive the latest updates. The stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individual or organization. They are shared with the intention of spreading human values in life and have been rewritten with the support of AI. If there are any mistakes, kindly overlook them with understanding.